We've not received any notifications or requests to use Welsh today, so we will be broadcasting and talking in English. I need to remind you, of course, that we are being webcast, so please can you make sure that you use your microphones. Thank you for our invitees for attending, and in case of fire drill, please follow the exit signs. And again, can members sign the register that's going around? Have we had any apologies, please?
Yes, Chair, we've had apologies from Councillors Rose Seaborn and Leo Waite.
Thank you very much. Agenda item number 2, declarations of interest. Members, have you got any declarations to make?
May I come in, Chair, at this point, please? Yeah, just to remind members, if they do have any declarations, could they please record them in the appropriate part of the attendance register, that's the sheet that's attached to the attendance register that's going around. One matter I'm aware of, Chair, from speaking to the members beforehand, item 5 on the agenda, the review of dog controls in Torvine. Councillor Shepherd, I believe you are on the committee of an organisation who may be affected by these potential orders and is in fact specifically mentioned, and in those circumstances I understand you wish to declare a personal but non-prejudicial interest. Is that right, Councillor Shepherd?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. That was my advice to Councillor Shepherd, was on balance I thought it was not prejudicial, Chair, because of the nature of the committee and the fact that obviously the committee is making recommendations as opposed to making any specific decisions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for the advice. Members, on to the minutes of the meeting held on the 7th of March. Just to remind you, though, these are the minutes that relate to how the local authority is working towards the regional homeless strategy. I'm assuming members have scanned through the minutes for accuracy. Would you like to confirm that the minutes are an accurate record?
Yeah.
Thank you, members. Action sheet, agenda item 4. Chris, is there any update on the action sheet?
Chair, just to confirm that the recommendations from the previous committee were sent to the relevant executive member and the response has been received and circulated.
Thank you, Chris.
Excuse me, Chair.
Thank you,
yes, and I do apologise for not bringing it up at that particular meeting, but can we refer back to the meeting we had on the Kingdom? I think it was the Kingdom, wasn't it? Can I ask that we request the executive member or an officer to advise members, perhaps on a monthly basis, where this officer is actually patrolling and how many fixed penalty notices have been issued? That would then reassure members that something is actually happening, and then we can pass that on to residents who contact us requesting that information.
Yeah, good point.
Excellent idea. Members all in agreement with that? And I'm assuming that this is all members as opposed to just this committee.
Yes.
Can we action that then, please, Chris?
Yes.
Thank you. On to agenda item 5, review of the dog control orders. I'll just remind members that the purpose of this report is to enable members of the committee to provide views and comments in relation to the amended draft public spaces protection order following consultation, and provide views and comments in relation to other matters arising by the consultees. May I welcome Mr Marshall and Mr Thompson to our meeting, who are going to give us an overview of the report. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, if it's okay, we'll quickly go through the report. There's a lot of information in there, and then obviously we'll take questions at the end, if that's all right, Chair. I'll take members straight into the main report, if that's okay. If we go straight through to 4.2 on page 1, we introduced the dog control orders in 2013 in Torvine, and these created the offences of failing to remove dog fees from a public area, as well as enabling the authority to restrict access to dogs in sensitive areas such as schools, recreation grounds, etc. And an individual who has control of a dog in breach of one of the orders can receive a fixed penalty notice, which is currently £100. What's happened though since then is in October 2014 there was a new piece of legislation, the Antisocial Behaviour Crime and Policing Act. Moving over to page 2 now, members. And amongst other things, we have the power to introduce dog controls under this new system of public spaces protection orders. And what it actually did was it actually replaced the dog control order system. And when that legislation came into place, we had 3 years the Act also gives local authorities 3 years to replace any existing dog control orders with public space protection orders. So what's happened is we did start the review of the current orders, but actually in the legislation under 4.4 members, you'll see that on the 20th of October, the authority's existing dog controllers were automatically replaced by public spaces protection. In other words, they just transitioned into a public space protection order underneath the legislation. And unless we don't do anything about it, unless we decide not to change them, that'll be in place for 3 years, and we have to review them every 3 years. But as I said, if you move down to 4.5, we were already started a review of the current public space, the current dog control orders, and we'd started to do the pre-consultation work there. And we felt that this was an opportunity to have a look at the areas where the dog restrictions applied and enable them to be more focused and to refine them before we replace the 2 orders that we've already got, the order that we've already got. So, following a review under 4.5, following a review of the current orders and the completion of other necessary pre-consultation work, which we'll go through in the report because it's quite substantial, the Chief Officer for Neighbourhoods Planning and Public Protection gave approval for the commencement of a formal public consultation exercise, which has now been completed and, as you've read, was actually well subscribed in relation to the new Public Spaces Protection Order, and this consultation commenced on the 15th of November. So what we've got there in 4.6, the draft Public Space Protection Order as it stands now after consultation is outlined in Appendix 2. And it does include the list of all the dog exclusion and dogs on leads areas that are being proposed, and maps of the proposed exclusion areas and dogs on lead areas can be accessed via the link under the heading Proposed PSPO Dog Control Maps for March 18. So those maps are as it stands under the proposal that we're putting before yourselves today. So, moving on through then, if we move to section 7 of the report on page 2 at the bottom there, issues and findings of the pre-consultation. I wanted to cover this just because there's actually quite a lot of work to do before we actually go out to consult. And that was started. I'd like to thank Richard Marshall especially. He's done a lot of work on this, and I know many of you may have had contact with him over the period. He's worked very, very hard. And if I'm stumped by a difficult question today, I know I can just turn to my right and he'll be able to answer. I hope, anyway. But I think at the outset it was clear that the current number of dog exclusion areas, which is estimated at 250, it was quite hard to count them on the maps, was unnecessary and was in any case unenforceable. In many cases only small parcels of random land had been earmarked as dog exclusion zones, and there was no obvious public health protection reason for doing that. And without signage in any case we couldn't enforce in those areas. So they were largely redundant in any case from the time, probably from when they came in. So what we did is we've adopted the following assessment really as a criteria when looking at the review and looking at the revised order, and this is over on page 3. Basically the bullet points there: all land which is open to the air and to which the public is entitled to have access will almost certainly be covered by a dog fouling ban under the new PSPO, and obviously that's persons who do not properly clean up and dispose of the dog's mess. The second sort of guideline was dog exclusion areas. There should only be in areas where it is deemed necessary to provide further protection from dog fouling in high public health areas, high public health risk areas, school grounds, designated children's play areas, marked sports pitches, and obviously there's the single lapwing breeding area also. So at the start you can see that actually they're going to reduce down significantly from the 250 that we currently had. And there was other measures as well, and these were suggested as a result of the pre-consultation, the dog exclusion zones in other areas, for example, dog exclusion zones in other areas. And it was also put to us dogs on leads areas were to be considered on a case-by-case basis, and we'll discuss those as we go through the report. So we started the process with Richard and other colleagues as well of remapping all the smart sports pitches in Torvine, and a pre-consultation exercise with all private pitch owners and lessees of the former Torvine Council managed pitches known as community asset transfers. We'll call them CAT pitches from now on. This was necessary in order to gauge the level of interest in nominating the pitches as dog exclusion areas. And there's approximately 44 CAT pitches, and these were all contacted. And about 41% or 18 responded. And of those who responded in support, were in support, 80%, 41% of all of those who responded were in support of dogs being excluded from their pitches due to frequent problems of fouling on the playing surface and the health risks associated. And 11 of the private pitches were contacted with 8 responses received, and 4 indicated their support for dog exclusion areas on their land. The bowling clubs were contacted, but whilst they're supportive of dog exclusion, they felt because of the boundaries in their areas they didn't need to be included. It should be noted that private landowners committee members whose pitches have been subject to CAT transfer were responsible for the costs and procurement of signage, and that's the sort of policy we've adopted really over the last year when we've been doing on our work on the existing areas. Under 7.5, all schools, nurseries and colleges in Torvine were consulted. This is the pre-consultation, and their sites were included in public consultation of potential dog exclusion areas, and there was widespread support for this. Similarly, children's play areas in Torvine were included for the consultation as dog exclusion areas, and this also received wide support. So 7.7, following pre-consultation exercise with stakeholders that we've outlined above, approximately 150 dog exclusion areas were identified for consultation, and as we said here, this was the anticipated significant reduction. So 7.8, where there was requests for dogs on leads areas to be considered, and officers were asked by local ward members and the executive member to consider proposals for dogs on leads areas in the consultation. And just to explain that this is an offence that has not previously been adopted here and would make it an offence to let a dog off a lead in specified areas. We were asked to consider 2 specific areas because of concerns raised historically about dog-on-dog attacks, risk to wildlife, and conflicts between different users in and around bodies of waters at these locations, and they were Garn Lakes Local Nature Reserve near Blenavon and the Cumbrian Boating Lake also. And these areas were considered sort of high risk for this purpose because there's large numbers of users converging on narrow footpaths surrounding the lakes. So pre-consultation 7.8, to users of Cumbrian Boating Lake were spoken to during a public engagement session, and there was substantial support for the proposal from both the dog walking and non-dog walking community using the area. Support was also received from the authority's countryside access officer, the senior ecologist, and an organisation called Swan Rescue. And on that basis, it was mapped and included in the consultation as a proposal for a dogs on leads area. Garn Lakes Nature Reserve, well, all 3 ward members asked for the proposal to be included due to the number of complaints they'd received from constituents about dog-on-dog attacks, risks to wildlife, and people feeling intimidated by dogs running loose, and conflicts between the different users of the lakes. On that basis, it was mapped and included in the consultation to gauge public opinion further. We also considered Pontypool Park as a dogs on leads area, and it should be borne in mind that the dog fouling order would apply here, and there are exclusion zones. But in addition, or there are proposed exclusion zones, but in addition, the Waste and Street Scene Operations Manager basically suggested this area for a dogs on leads area. I don't think they were clear on which parts. That's true.
However, and also there was no historical evidence to support this request, and so Richard did some pre-consultation exercise with key stakeholders.
And the following stakeholders were either against or felt unable to support the proposal. That's Torvine Leisure Trust, Pontypool and District Runners, Torvine Green Dog Walkers. The following stakeholders also didn't respond, which is Dogs of Torvine and Paws on Patrol. And we also visited Pontypool Park and spoke to approximately 30 users, and approximately 60% said they were against such a proposal there. There was the issue, unfortunately we had to draw a line under that and get on with the Welsh translation, all the work we had to do for the consultation. And the Friends of Pontypool Park came in after that in favour of dogs on leads in the areas. So we were unable to include it, we'd already moved on with the work, we were unable to conclude it as a firm proposal for consultation, but they were still able to respond as part of the formal consultation that came through afterwards. So there was just 2 dogs on leads proposals for the area that were new, and those were the ones outlined above, which was on the Garn Lakes Local Nature Reserve and the Cumbrae Boating Lake. So then, under Section 8 now, members, we're getting into the formal consultation and really what we did and the outcomes. Okay. So the consultation took place over a 4-week period between the 15th of November and the 15th of December. There was also a bit of work done after the consultation period ended, just to clarify a few things with some interested parties. And you'll see under 8.2, which you'll be pleased to know I won't read through for you, that there's a list of 43 organisations, and obviously that's including members of the committee, ward members and other relevant organisations as part of the consultation. So we'll zip through to very briefly on 8.3. And just to say that the consultation was hosted on the Council's consultation hub, and consultees were asked to complete an online survey incorporating their comments, and it was made up of the following 9 questions. I won't go through all those now, because I'll go through them under Section 10 when I do the consultation questions and the outcomes. Okay, just under 8.4 at the bottom there, the temporary public notices were erected at all the proposed dog exclusion and dogs on lead areas during the consultation period. And that's something that will happen again before the final order comes in. And all Torvine schools and nurseries were asked to erect public notices at their sites during the consultation period. Richard and also other officers from the public health team hosted 3 public drop-in sessions during the consultation period. These were hosted in Blaenavon, Pontypool and Cumbrae Library, and there was reasonably, a small or reasonable level of attendance to each, which you can see the numbers there. But they did prove to be very useful and allowed people to meet officers face to face and ask questions about the various restrictions in their respective neighbourhoods. And for members of the community unable to go online, hard copies of the Public Space Protection Order consultation documents were taken along to the drop-in sessions, and copies were made available in the reception area of the T-Blind Council offices in New Inn throughout the consultation period, and that included all the maps, if they couldn't get online. Okay. They were 8.9 details of the consultation were sent over to 20,000 registered users of Torvine Facebook, and 2 separate reminder posts were sent out during the period also. They were also sent out to the registered users of Gwent Now communication, courtesy of Gwent of the Gwent police system, and an article was put out via the Torvine Weekly News Bulletin, and there were the usual press releases as well. So really now we're getting into the results of the public consultation. 367 formal responses were received, which I think is a very good return and a very good consultation response. 30, and obviously the majority of those were in English and 1 was in Welsh. Numerous emails and telephone calls were received during the period. And Richard's, and other officers have worked very hard. They responded to every email or telephone inquiry to either clarify verbally any queries or to forward any additional information that had been requested. And wherever possible, inquiries were asked to submit formal comments via the online survey in order for them to be properly captured. 4 letters were received during the consultation period. 1 expressing support for dogs and leads at Garn Lakes, 1 opposed. One letter queried the reasoning for not allowing dogs to run free on a sports field, and one letter opposed the proposal for a dog exclusion area on a small piece of public open space off Poplar Avenue in New Inn. 9.4, formal written responses were received from the RSPCA, the Kennel Club and Keep Wales Tyne and the Dogs Trust, and these are included in the appendices and Appendix 5 members. Cumbrian Community Council responded, which essentially raised concerns about dog fouling in children's play areas, concerns about how the new order would be enforced, the importance of establishing land ownership details, and the need to provide more bins and replace missing ones. Pontypool Community Council confirmed their full support for the order. No responses were received from any other consultees, such as the Police and Crime Commissioner, and Iron Bevan Health Board, Natural Resources Wales, or any of the registered social landlords. We're aware of an online petition opposing the Dogs on Lease proposal for the Garn Lakes Nature Reserve. However, at the time of writing this report, and I assume still is the case, this has not been submitted to the Council. So we get into consultation outcomes, and this is why I'll go through the questions, members. Rich has gone through each and every response and given it due consideration, and it was a lot of work, I have to say. He's done a fantastic job. The main response trends for each of the parts are outlined below. Part 1, dog fouling. We were proposing that the widespread dog fouling, offensive dog failure to remove dog faeces on any land in Torvine to which the public have access would continue, and we asked people for their thoughts on that. 359 responses were received, 312 in support, 8 against, and there were 39 neutral comments. And the following underneath were the themes. 95 respondents questioned the Council's ability to enforce the legislation or would like to see more enforcement. 55 respondents commented on the need for more bins. 29 suggested that the Council should nominate dog parks or dog exercise areas. A number asked for 18 asked for signage to be clearer. 16 respondents suggested that the fine or penalty should be increased. 10 respondents took the opportunity to state their opposition to the proposal at Garn Lakes. 7 respondents commented on the need for more education and awareness, and 6 respondents were of the opinion that the Council should impose a requirement to carry dog waters to carry a bag. And there's further comments under there as we carry on. There's one of the points there. 5 respondents suggested that we should provide free dog bags for dog mess. 3 respondents commented that the Council should be more lenient with dog exclusion enforcement. Some comments on horse and sheep mess, which we haven't got the powers to deal with, and 2 respondents felt that the final penalty was too high. 1 respondent took the opportunity to state their opposition to a ban on sports pitches. And lots of comments were received about littering around the edge of sports pitches also, and around dog mess bags being thrown in trees and bushes. So the summary basically of the first part of the order around dog fouling being an offence was that there seemed to be substantial support for the continuation of that. And basically, given the amount of support for that continuation, officers are inviting members' comments on our recommendation that Part 1 of the order in relation to dog fouling is reasonable and necessary to protect public health, and that no amendments to this proposal are required. To Part 2 then of these is in relation to exclusion areas. And again, we have the online survey, and it basically said that we currently have 250 dog exclusion areas in Torvine, and we're proposing to reduce these to 150. And the Council considers that dog exclusion areas should apply to 3 categories of land in the main, namely school grounds, marked sports pitches, and designated children's play areas. And a revised dog exclusion area is also proposed for the Latwin breeding area near the Garn Lakes Local Nature Reserve in Blaenabon. And we asked for their views on that. The proposals for dogs to continue to be excluded from children's play areas have been analysed in school grounds, and we feel that there's been considerable support for the continuation of that. However, with regard to marked sports pitches, obviously there was, as you will have read, there was a bit more of a mixed response. A number of comments received expressing concerns about the proposal. 14 respondents specifically expressed their opposition, and 10 consultees commented that they support the idea of a ban, but only when the pitches are in use. Consultees that provided detailed comments, and those are in Appendix 5, expressed concern that the dog exclusion areas in relation to marked sports pitches can be too restrictive and should be kept to a minimum to ensure that there's adequate availability of green open space for dogs to exercise freely and socialise, and where necessary there should be clear signage. No other members of the public, ward members or relevant council officers, for example grounds maintenance, objected to the proposed dog exclusion areas. 10.3.5, 22 respondents specifically expressed their support for dogs being excluded from marked sports pitches. These were in addition to those responsible for sports pitches that were in favour of the restrictions during pre-consultation, so that's the cat pitches, to the paragraph referred to previously. And that's because of the frequent problem of foulings on sports pitches and the public health implications. The next question was, do you wish to suggest any further areas for dog exclusion? And there were 181 responses. But I think it was felt that there may have been a little bit of confusion here, as these responses took some analysis to read out the issues. The majority of the suggestions were made either for areas already being proposed as dog exclusion areas, or were for areas that do not comply with the council's criteria. Again, school grounds, children's play areas, etc. After the results had been analysed, the full list of proposed dog exclusion areas were reviewed. Particular emphasis was given to those sites where comments or objections had been received during the consultation. And as a result of the consultation, 10.3.9 amendments have been made to the following dog exclusion areas. Pentwyn Children's Park, the substantial reduction in the area covered by the dog exclusion area to include only the area in and around the play equipment. Pontier Church in Wales Primary School, a reduction in the extent of the exclusion area to more accurately reflect the position of the school's playing field. Pontier District Social Club, which is the cricket and football club, reduction in the extent of the dog exclusion area to include only the wicket area and not the oval, not the cricket pitch. And there's history with that one. I think initially when it was first introduced, it was the whole oval, and there were representations made to the executive member at the time in 2013, and it was reduced to the wicket area, which is what it currently stands. And again, in that location, an amendment to the dog exclusion area to more accurately reflect the position of the fixed boundary of the football pitch. Northfields Children's Play Area and Skateboard Park, the exclusion area that was proposed is to be reduced there also. And there's one which has been taken out completely, which is the play area of Poplar Avenue in New Inn. That's been removed from the list in response to opposition from local dog walkers and following a review of its usage and discussions with the Waste and Street Scene manager who agrees that it's not a marked sports area and is not widely used. But the fouling order will still apply there. When it comes to the cat clubs and pitches, at the time we drafted this report, there's 14 community asset transfer sports clubs that have not responded to officers' requests for involvement, despite numerous attempts to make contact and during the formal consultation period. So that's pre-consultation and formal consultation, and post-consultation, we've made contact with these. We've tried to make contact with these organisations. But we've mapped them in any case. We'd mapped them for the consultation, and we're going to keep them in as exclusion areas because they're council land at the end of the day, and they're sports pitches. However, unless they come forward and say yes, we want to be included and we'll pay for the signage, then it's not something that will be actively enforced. But it's better to keep them in when it's our land. Because then if they do come forward within the 3-year period, we don't need to review the whole thing again. So it's a lot more practical for us to do that. There are 10.4.2, there are also 12 cat sports clubs that have responded. However, without wanting to get into it too much here, there is still a little bit of legal discussion here over lease arrangements and there's disagreement with the authority about who should pay for signage. So again, that's not as officers, we are not directly involved in that, so we'll map them, we'll put them in, and if that's concluded, it gives us the option to enforce there, should they agree for signage at a later time. And then the decision on private pitches. It is unfortunate that but at this time the following sports pitches have been removed from the proposed list of dog exclusion areas, as persons responsible for these pitches haven't responded to the repeated requests inviting them to petition to participate during the pre-consultation and the consultation period, and also a letter that we sent from the executive member after that also. So there's a list there. I'm not aware that there's been any opposition to those pitches from elsewhere, to those areas being included. They just haven't responded. But because they're not our land at the moment, we're proposing to exclude them, because we would want the landowner's agreement before we put them in. But 10.4.5, it should be noted that any of the above private pitches, if they make contact with us prior to the final approval by Cabinet, and we've got the time to do it, then it should still, they could still come in if they want to. So, summary of that part then, as part two, the exclusion areas. We've made amendments, and some have been removed, and the total number of dog exclusion areas has now been reduced further from approximately 150 to 138. And a full list can be found in Annex 1 of Appendix 2, which is the draft order that we're asking members to comment on. And a map of the proposed exclusion areas can be accessed via the link below. And then dogs on leads areas, members, we did ask the following questions. Are you in favour of the proposed dogs on leads areas at Cumbrae and Boating Lake? And it was 64-36 with the actual numbers there for you as well. 64-36% in favour. Dogs on leads, are you in favour of the dogs on lead areas for the Garn Lakes Local Nature Reserve? And again, quite a lot of respondents, and 57% in favour. And again, I refer there again to the online petition, which we touched on earlier, which has not been submitted to the council. Further support for the Dogs on Leads proposal for Garn Lakes Nature Reserve was also received in the form of an email from Garnier Angling Club. 10.5.4, do you wish to suggest any further areas for consideration for Dogs on Leads? And 182 responses were received to this. 35 answered yes and suggested additional dogs on lead areas, and those are listed below, and 120 answered no, confirming that they would not like the council to propose any additional areas other than those two currently being proposed. And the list of the additional areas is under 10.5.6. 13 respondents suggested Pontypool Park and 7 were opposed. 5 respondents suggested all public footpaths and public areas. 6 respondents suggested Torvines Local Nature Reserves. 4 respondents suggested the canal towpath. 7 respondents suggested the cycle track, mainly Blaenavon and Pontypool area. And 2 respondents suggested cemeteries and graveyards, which included a request from the council cemeteries and allotment officer, who commented that dogs must be kept on a short league and under control whilst in cemeteries. Then the question 7, please give us any other thoughts and comments on the proposal, and there were 240 responses to this question. And on analysis, which has found that there were approximately 75 general comments in support of the council's Dogs on Leads proposals and approximately 82 comments against. So Richard's had to do a lot of work to summarise all that and come to a conclusion, and we've had a lot of discussion about it as well. And with regard to the consultation outcomes, the majority of votes received were in support of the current Dogs on Leads proposals for the Garn Lakes Nature Reserve and Cumbrae Boating Lake. And since that formal consultation ended, we've had further consultation with the local ward members also, to let them know what the consultation outcomes were and see how they felt about that. And they remain supportive. And so as such, officers are recommending that the Dogs on Leads areas, the Garn Lakes Nature Reserve and Cumbrae and Boating Lake should continue to be included as part of the draft Public Space Protection Order for consideration by yourselves and by Cabinet, subject to your recommendations. And again, Appendix 2 has got the draft order and the list of the dog controls, which you can access by the link. After some thought, given the numbers under 10.5.6 were quite low, only a handful of people, 13 at the most, we're putting forward not to put any more dogs on these areas proposed at this time. But we ask for your comments on that also. So, other matters raised, and as part of the public spaces protection. And so, when we ask these questions, members of the public and others will raise other issues. And one of the 6 respondents requested the council to impose a legal requirement for dog walkers to carry poop scoop bags. So members may wish to consider this. For a little bit of further information, 3 authorities in Wales have actually introduced that, although it's never really been enforced. It's largely been a question of dialogue and warnings and informal action. And that was something that the RSPCA put forward as well in their response, which is in the appendix, in the appendices there. But I think the Dogs Trust were concerned about the enforcement of that, to be honest. And it isn't something that we're putting forward, but we'd like to take your views on that. So that's something that can be included in the order, subject to further discussion with yourselves and further consideration. Other matters raised, not related to the public spaces protection, and they were just raised as part of it, but it's not something we can legislate for. What we're doing here, members, is we're actually making local laws, and therefore this is not these 3 items here are not something we can do. But people wanted more bins, 55 respondents, and 29 respondents suggested that the council should designate dog parks or dog exercise areas. That's not something we can legislate for. And 5 respondents suggested that the council should provide free poop scoop bags. Okay. As I said, they're not matters we can legislate for, but you may wish to comment on them anyway. That's largely the end of the consultation part. I'd like to just touch on a couple of issues about the process that we go further to here. We'll obviously take your recommendations on board, and then we'll report them to the executive member, and we'll start drafting the report to Cabinet. This could take some time. I think we've got the AGM coming up as well, and the usual annual things that the authority does. So we're hoping to sort of get it to Cabinet for final approval by hopefully the end of June or earlier. And that would then lead us to do more work during the summer period. We've got to take holidays into annual leave and the holiday periods into account. And we've got to advertise. We'll do a review of signage, and we will be looking to bring them in either September for the commencement date, either September or October in 2018. There's some indication of 11.3 about some sort of costs about how we would do that. 11.6 has got some social inclusion and equalities issues, which I know we've discussed enforcement before, and that just confirms what we've discussed in the past. If I take members to the risks area under section 12, we think risks are low, really. We think reputationally the authority is acting responsibly in reviewing the current dog control order offences, given the length of time since they were first approved, and the high number of dog exclusion areas, which are largely just basically a colouring in on a map. We wanted to make it more refined and more targeted. The proposed reduction in the dog exclusion areas provides a better balance for the wider community between dog exclusion controls and areas where people can freely exercise their dogs. Now, this came out in the consultation. We're reducing the current exclusion areas from 250 to 138, and we think that reflects a reasonable response to people's concerns about being able to walk their dogs in restrict-free areas. Really, I think that's probably it, members, really. I think I'll finish there and take a sip of water and then take any questions that you've got. Thank you.
Thank you very much for going through that report. So, members, it's over to us for some questions. If you don't mind, I'll start off with the questions. I think really for me, what are the practical implications associated with implementing this order?
Well, the practical implications will be, once the order is approved at Cabinet, as I touched on earlier, we'll have a lead-in period where we are required by law to put some notices up that the order will be coming in a reasonable time. There will be a review of signage, and obviously this report isn't strictly about enforcement. We've touched on enforcement in previous meetings. These are the areas that we were looking at to enforce. So really, it's going to be the practical implications will be really around advertising it, reviewing signage and putting relevant signage up, and officer time. Really, those are the practical implications for us once the orders are approved.
Thank you. Councillor Thomas, you've indicated you have a question.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, why was it felt necessary to implement the order within Torvine?
The authority, the authority has taken a stance 4 or 5 years ago now that it wanted dog control areas in the area, and there was 250 or so of them as exclusion areas on a dog fouling order. And as explained earlier, really, it's necessary because these have never been reviewed or revoked. And it's necessary because the dog control orders automatically became public space protection orders in October. They immediately transferred over in them before we'd started, just after we'd started the review of the actual areas. So what we needed to do really is to review all the areas, take out the ones that were unnecessary, consult on them. We've had a consultation response where people feel that there is still a need for a dog fouling order, there is still a need for dog exclusion areas, and as we've touched on, there was some additional response in relation to more control on dogs and dogs on leads areas. So we already had them in place in effect, so we just wanted to review and refine them. Is there a need for them? Well, we still get quite a number of complaints about dog fouling. Over the last few years, we've had, I think, 146 about 3 years ago, 84 the year before last, and 72 so far in this financial year, which is actually low in comparison to other areas. But yes, there is still a perception and a reality that we do get complaints, and that there is a need for these in the area. As far as enforcement is concerned, and again, it's not about who does the enforcement today, it's about the areas we're going to enforce. But there is still, there's been, since the pilot started in May, there's been 95 fixed penalty notices served for dog exclusion areas and 10 for fouling. So there is still a perception. Obviously, then we get, which I don't have today, but we've touched on in previous discussions that we've had about this around the cleaning costs, and there is still, I can't break that down, we're not the street scene section, but there is still quite a bit of cost and activity that goes on in relation to keeping the borough clean in relation to dog mess.
Chair, I'd also like to point out, I think the results of the consultation, the outcome results in particular, provide evidence of the need for continuation of an order in one form or another. As Dave suggested earlier, we don't feel that the current order is fit for purpose any longer. The new order that we're proposing is much more focused and refined. Obviously, there's significant support for us to continue with the offence of dog fouling. But also there's an awful lot of support, as you've seen from the results, for us to continue to provide an additional level of protection for those 3 categories of land. Certainly children's play areas, widespread support, school grounds, widespread support, but also the marked sports pitches. It's obviously got to be borne in mind that there was some opposition to the marked sports pitches as well, absolutely. But overall, when you look at the results, the majority of respondents are in favour of it, providing there's adequate signage and that enforcement is proportionate and targeted and based on need. If the order is approved in whatever format, that will carry us through then for the next 3 years.
Thank you for that. I think Councillor Shepherd's indicated she wants a supplementary to Councillor Thomas's.
Going back, 8.2 is we've got the responses of the public consultation, 367. Have we got figures from the stakeholders? How many of those responded, and how were they consulted, please?
Okay,
It's
yeah.
got, I say it's got 43 and it's not exhaustive, but how were they consulted, and what's the figures that came back to, please?
Okay, yeah. So as you can see in 8.2, we've got a list of all of the stakeholders that we thought warranted direct email consultation. So each and every one of these were either contacted via direct email or social media posts. Some of the large consultees have been included in the appendix, like Keep Wales Tidy and RSPCA and so on. But the rest of them, their comments have been incorporated into the broader results that are presented in the report. I haven't got the figures in front of me, unfortunately, to tell you which of those responded and didn't. For those that responded via the online survey, which was our preferred route for a response, because at least we can formally capture the response then and include it in the statistics, there was no requirement there for them to leave their contact details. We thought long and hard about this, and we had lots of pre-discussions about this, and in the end we decided that we would just request a postcode to be left. We were concerned that if we required full names and addresses and so on, then that would put a lot of people off. So comments could be left anonymously. We just asked for a postcode so we could do some basic analysis on the location of where the respondents were from. But in addition to that, it is fair to say that some of them provided a direct email response then back to officers. But unfortunately, I haven't got the figures, but I can provide those.
Going back to, obviously, with the dog exclusion zones, is Coburn Farm, and our community group wasn't consulted. We were there from the 17th of November, and it's got from the 15th to the November to December, so we weren't, and it affects us massively. So we're going forward trying to organise dog walking classes, and we're in a dog exclusion zone, but 100%, we've had no email or we've got a real good following on a Facebook page, and we weren't consulted at all.
And your organisation is listed?
Yes.
There?
Yeah.
Okay.
38.
Sorry.
Let's start that again.
Sorry. So we're referring to an organisation at point 38 on page 6, which is Trevethin Matters Community Group. And just to answer your question, Councillor, that particular group was contacted via a social media post, which I believe was sent to the Facebook account by our communications team at launch of consultation, so it would have been around the 15th of November. And I also personally remember emailing all ward members for Trevethin were emailed directly as well, including the councillor at the time, Councillor Matthew Ford, I believe, because I remember emailing him personally to talk specifically about Coburn Farm, to see if there was any interest in it being included.
Okay, I think we'll be having a wider discussion on that one a little bit later, but I know Councillor Evans wants to come in here.
Is on that 8.2 where you say about the item 15, is any of these organisations with dogs like the RSPCA, Paws on Patrol, come back to you regarding dogs on leads? Because I just seen an article in the paper just before I came to the meeting I would see this implications for dogs at the moment with Alabama rot. Now, are we getting any response from them regarding these control orders of any use to stop this spreading?
Thank you, Councillor. Not specifically about Alabama rot. I don't recall that being mentioned by any of the consultees. Some of the key consultees are mentioned in number 15 on 8.2, such as the RSPCA, Dogs Trust, the Kennel Club. Their detailed responses have been included in Appendix 5, but no specific mention, as far as I recall, of Alabama rot.
Thank you for that. It's something that you mentioned about, following on from that really, there was a list, and this is just an observation, not a question. In 9.8, it says no responses were received from other key consultees, such as Gwent Police, Gwent Crime Commissioner for Gwent and Iron Bevan Health Board, Natural Resources Wales, or any of the registered social landlords. I'm really surprised and disappointed in that because, you know, children catch diseases from dog fouling. You'd think that health would want to have an input. A lot of the complaints, particularly on land that's public land land that's owned by registered social landlords, have massive problems with dog fouling. So I'm really surprised that they have not responded to this. I'm slightly disappointed that they've not taken the opportunity to influence this. And that does shock me, really. I suppose, going on further too, are there any alternatives available to address dog fouling, perhaps? Or are you solely relying on?
These are the ones we can legislate for. What we're doing is creating local bylaws. So, as for alternatives, we've looked at what other authorities have done, and a lot of them have done very, very similar. We've got a list of local authorities in Wales here. A lot of them have done very similar things. A lot of them have got orders. Some of them, but in relation to dog fouling specifically, it's usually pretty much a blanket approach as far as the creation of the local bylaw is concerned. Obviously, it's up to the authority whether it chooses to hand out free poop scoop bags, the number of the bins available, the regularity of emptying, to keep the area clean where the order's not been complied with. The sort of legal power that we have is largely... there's also the thing about which the three authorities have done around choosing to create an offence of not carrying a bag as well, which is one which is interesting.
Thank you for that. Councillor Jones, you've indicated you want to ask. Mr Haynes, how will you make it clear to dog owners at the start of a restricted area and the end of a restricted area?
Yeah, it can be challenging. It's challenging now, isn't it? It's really it all depends on specific site locations and the accesses to and from. So really, it's about signage and clear signage. And I know signage is something that this committee has commented on under previous recommendations. Those recommendations have been taken on board, and the signage review is ongoing and will be informed. As I said earlier, as part of the practical implementation, we'll be reviewing signage. I know the executive member is keen where appropriate to put maps on signage, and that's something that other authorities have done to main entrances and that. Alternatively, really it's going to be about adequate signage, especially where where there isn't any other barriers there. For example, some sports pitches have railings around and things like that. So the answer really is going to be around publicising it and signage, and also, as I said earlier, before it's after cabinet approval and once it comes into force, we've got a lead-in time where we have to put notices out to remind them. So there'll be a bit like a planning notice that you get tied to a lamppost or in other conspicuous areas.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Evans, you've indicated you have a question?
Yeah. In 11.4, you state that further communication will be undertaken up until the revised order is implemented by the council? How will you do this?
Well, again, I think that largely refers to what I've just touched on in the answer to the previous question, really. We will be communicating we'll put a press release once the new orders come out. We'll be putting signage up or notices up in the relevant locations, and we'll be publicising it. We did mention earlier that if some of the if some of the private sports pitch owners come forward in time, then we've got the option to include them as well. But there'll be an implementation process, and I know that the executive member is also keen to do some sort of work in relation to enforcement around YouTube videos and things like that, which explain sort of like infomercials, if you like, explaining it to the public as well. I think I've more got a face for radio than TV, so I'll let one of the others do that.
Also, Chair, the 10 months or so I've been working on this. I've developed quite an extensive sort of contact list now for various stakeholders and individuals and persons responsible for the various sports pitches that we have in the borough. The list, as I said, is quite extensive, so it's my proposal to direct email all of those individuals again on many occasions, I would have thought, just to make sure we get that message out there. And it's going to be particularly important for the heavy footfall areas, because we know that we've got a lot of visitors coming into Torvine from outside of the area to enjoy some of our public open space. I was just talking to someone from Aberdeen today, a dog walker, who likes to visit Garn Lakes on that occasion. I've spoken to people from Brecon coming to our area, and also those within a more reasonable travelling distance of the borough, living in the boroughs that we border with. It's an ongoing challenge. Signage has absolutely got to be right, but obviously it was mentioned earlier, lots and lots of consultees touched upon that. It's very important, and it's going to be incredibly important as well for any new areas or new offences that we may be proposing, such as the dogs on leads restrictions. That's something that's going to be new for the borough, and if it is approved, we've got a lot of work to do to make sure that message is put out there, and that signage is clear and conspicuous, and at every recognised entry point to these areas, which again is a challenge, even with the pitches. For every pitch you could have up to 7 or 8 recognised entry points, and ideally they should all be signposted so that no one can enter a restricted area without having passed a sign.
Again, in sort of relation to that, and going back to your question, actually, Faye, for me, there's some anomalies, and I'm being a little bit parochial here, forgive me, but in the list of the wards, in St Giles ward, you have 2 of the ones that I have concerns about, Cumbrawn Park Tennis Courts and Cumbrawn Park Putting Green, both of which, as standalone, I agree with what's planned. However, there are pathways that run through the park into around the putting green and in and around past the tennis courts. Are those pathways also going to be part of the exclusion area? Because that park in particular is used as a walkway from Old Cumbrawn up to Hentless Way and Fairwater and Tulops, and people use that path walking their dogs through as an area as a walkway, not just for their dogs, but so I get the need for the putting green and the tennis court to be safeguarded. However, there's pathways that lead right through that concern me, and I'd like somehow, how are you going to address that?
Okay, thanks, Chair. I think we spoke actually, didn't we, about these 2 areas some time ago when we were going through this mapping exercise. It's the playing surfaces that we want to provide an additional level of protection for the public health risk. So it wouldn't necessarily include a footpath, especially if it's a right of way. We can't ban dogs from public rights of way. The dog fouling offence would remain, of course, so there will be protection. But what we're talking about here on this list are exclusion areas. Okay, so coming back to the ward that you're interested in with the putting green, and Cumbrae Park, it would just be the playing surfaces. Okay.
So if we refer to the map on that, it should just be, you should be able to see the path not included. It should just be the restricted area coloured in.
And I'd sort of suggest there's probably some other areas that members and ward members would want some clarification on. So use of the map and maybe some information sent out to each ward member with the map before this is decided would be a good exercise if we could list that down as a recommendation. Right, okay, we're now... Oh, Councillor Jones, you wanted to come in as a supplementary.
Please, I was just going to ask, with the signage, I know you're going to put temporary ones up to start with, but are they going to be solid, you know, large signs? Because I think this has been part of the problem, that we don't want temporary things that can blow off in the wind or whatever, or get taken away. We want permanent signs.
Yes, thanks very much. We will be putting, first of all, temporary signage up, just as we did to raise awareness of the consultation. But obviously, by the very nature, that is just temporary. It's just to raise awareness for a short period of time. But, of course, when the order is approved, prior to us actually implementing it, and certainly prior to starting any enforcement, we have a statutory obligation to make sure the signage is adequate and sufficient. So that will mean permanent signage. Metal signs, which we use currently, which are normally installed via a galvanised pole or attached to some sort of solid surface such as a wall or a fence line, ideally poles, attached to them with clips, and they are as permanent as any sign can be. We do get incidents of these signs being defaced, damaged, not ripped down normally because they are very secure once they're installed, but that is a very important part of the process, and there's actually a legal obligation upon us to make sure that adequate signage is in place.
Good, thank you. Councillor Thomas, I think you've indicated, yeah?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Dave, I did mention this to you the last time you were here, and obviously we hear all the time about exclusion zones and restricted areas and all the rest of it. And looking through the report, both the Kennel Club and the RSPCA both backed up something that I mentioned to you last time about us providing more bins and actual designated areas like a dog pen where dog users could actually go and take the dogs so they could run freely, picnic bench in there or whatever, you know. Why have we decided against this? Surely this would be a good idea, and it would probably make us one of the first councils to do it, and encourage other dog owners and to comply with the order. I think, you know, we bang on enough about exclusion zones and restricted areas. Why don't we actually provide something for you know, dog users?
I think, leading on from that, there's an awful lot of rhetoric around the anti-dog, and I think that would go a long way to alleviate the you know, the accusation of the anti-dog.
Parts of the question then, there was bins and dog play areas. Bins, really, I would only advise members or any members of the public to contact the authority through the usual online or telephone routes to request the bins if they feel that they need additional bins in a certain area, or whether bins are need emptying. Sometimes they overflow and that sort of thing. It's not something we can necessarily legislate for in an order. It's about cost and provision and the practicality of provision and maintenance and cleaning. As far as dog parks, yes, we're not aware, although we think there may be some in Monmouth, yes, but I don't think, I'd be very surprised if they're generated from legislating. What we're doing is legislating here. My advice to anybody would be to identify a parcel of land, that if it's the local authority owned land, that is available, and speak to our estates department and start talking to them. But obviously then we need to find the resources to fence it off and make it attractive and put benches and things like that, so that it is a dog park. The dog order for fouling would still apply, but they could let them off the lead and run around within a controlled area and things like that. It's not something that we can legislate for. It's just something that we can just do. As far as I'm aware, we could make some inquiries with Monmouthshire, and perhaps Richard could be tasked to do that. But as far as I'm aware, it's something I think there's a lot of Australian or American idea, basically. But again, I don't think it's something we need to legislate for. We can't necessarily legislate to say this parcel of land is a dog park. We don't need to do that. Just identify the area and see if there's a resource there. But fouling would still apply. Bins would need to be available. They'd need to be. I'm not a dog owner, so I wouldn't imagine what to put in there. But obviously, there's got to be space to run around, and perhaps facilities, perhaps even toilets and things like that. So perhaps there's a lot more to it than just, it's investment.
Yeah, absolutely, Chair. It isn't something that is within the scope of this order. Although, having said that, in order to do it some justice, I've deliberately included it in the report. I've deliberately listed the number of respondents that mentioned a dog park, dog exercise area, what have you. The detailed consultations we've received from the likes of RSPCA dogs are all included for you to read at leisure. And you're quite right, a couple of them do support the idea of local authorities designating these areas. In my experience in speaking to colleagues in other local authorities, it's normally something I understand that's introduced by way of maybe a community council initiative. Certainly is something that's put forward and then seconded by ward members. In itself, it requires quite a lot of public consultation. You've got to think very carefully about which area you've got in mind, because there may well be quite a lot of opposition. Maybe some people feel they don't want to live next door to one of these dog exercise areas. And then you've got all sorts of issues then about the size of the area that's available to you, because by its very nature, for it to be an exercise area, you want it to be a fairly sizable piece of land, and that's not always possible, especially in the smaller communities. So there's a lot to be taken into account. We've given it some attention in the report, but I think it really is a matter that's beyond the scope of this particular order.
Do you want to come back in? Yeah.
Yeah, just quickly. I appreciate what you're saying. The boat lake, for example, Southfields, there are areas, quite large areas that it could be done. And I haven't spoken to you before, Richard, so I wanted to kind of pose the question to you. What do you actually think it would be a good idea? I'm sure you would see it would benefit to avoid, for us to pilot something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. There are many examples where it's worked. The nearest local authority I'm aware of where they have dog exercise areas is Monmouthshire. I think they've been introduced by way of the community councils. It definitely can work. In Southfields, that's an area with a heavy footfall. It's an area where we have some conflict between different users, dog walking community and non-dog walking community. I certainly received an awful lot of comments from people that use the Southfields area. And you are right, we're very lucky. We've got large open areas of green space down there that possibly could be utilised. But as I said earlier, it really is a matter for the respective ward members, and we can assist with that and certainly help with the consultation process. Ongoing maintenance, I think, seems to be the sticking point with dog exercise parks. Maintenance in terms of keeping them cut, maintenance in terms of the outlay initially in terms of the fence line and then maintaining the fence line, deciding whether or not we want to go as far as to providing bags at the entry points to the dog exercise parks, and also getting across that message that the offence of dog fouling still remains, because there's a lot of confusion about that. I've also got experience of some dog park areas that are definitely neglected. You can see that when you look at them, and what they ultimately become if you haven't got that maintenance built into it and the necessary budget, they become dog toilets. They become very undesirable areas, overgrown, full of dog mess, and dog walkers won't go anywhere near them then, you know. So there's lots to consider, I think.
Thank you. I think really is there any evidence, or what is the evidence that suggests this order will alleviate the problem, or the continuation of this order alleviates the problems?
Well, the order by itself won't alleviate the problems, but it gives us the powers to enforce, basically, in certain areas. And as you've seen from the consultation, as you know at the moment, we have one officer patrolling. We've discussed that at length, but this is about where rather than who is going to be enforcing the legislation. So really, I think what we've seen from the consultation is that there's been quite a number of respondents who said, yeah, it's okay doing that, especially from the cat pitches, who said it's okay to do that, but it's only worthwhile if there's going to be enforcement and there's going to be enough enforcement. That's what. But also quite a few of the general public responses asked for more enforcement as well. So we have to have something to enforce. That's the starting point. And the second point then, which is the other part of the strategy, which I know we've discussed at length, is the amount of enforcement that we do, as well as who. So really, it can only really alleviate it. Once word gets round that there's a high level of enforcement and there's a high number of patrols in the area with an adequate number of officers, then perhaps that will be as strong as actually serving the fixed penalty notices. But it's part of a two-pronged approach. We have to have the orders in place. There is an argument to say that members may wish to debate this afterwards, that if we're not going to have adequate enforcement, then is it worth having the dog exclusion areas at all? So that's the challenge, really. It is a fair point. It's a point I've made privately. It's a point we've discussed in here before. So really, the level of enforcement, if that's the approach, it goes back to the authorities' policy, clean and green priority, zero tolerance approach. And we need these if we want to have that zero tolerance approach. But there's another part of the jigsaw that needs to come in, and that's around, let's put aside who at the moment. I think we've had that debate, but really it's about how much, really. So who knows? There may be opportunities for that in the future to increase that. But at the moment, I think that the proposal is to have an enforcement presence, as you know, and we need the orders in place to actually do that. Thank you, Chair.
And I suspect the issue, a lot of the consideration really is that we have the orders in place, but are these nothing more than rubber stamping exercises if we can't fund full enforcement? And we'll have that debate afterwards, but I know that that's been raised with me several times, both in this discussion and in the previous. So I think we've, that needs to be considered as part of our recommendations. Anyway, Councillor Tu, you've indicated.
Will we be removing the dog bins that are currently proposed in the exclusion areas? Like the bins that's in Glansacken Park? Would you be removing them?
It all really depends on their location. I mean, we're basically sports pitches. I wouldn't have thought would have a dog bin on the sports pitch. So if they're close by, that's fine. But it all depends on the individual circumstance. I don't know the part you're referring to. Do you?
Yes, Councillor, I know the park. I'm just going to struggle to answer the question. We have no control over the allocation of bins.
Yeah. Well, it is a poop scoop bin, is it? It is a poop. Well, I guess it depends on its location. What else is in that park? Is it sports pitches?
Child area fenced off, and people run their dog in there every day.
In the child's area? In the park? Well, the general principle, we'd have to check the map on that. Is it okay if we check? But the general principle would be, it would only be the child's area that would be excluded. Okay, but do you want to make a note and we'll check on that, just to make sure?
Thank you very much for that. Councillor Jones, I think you've indicated for the next.
Thank you. I was just going to ask, why can't PSPOs be extended to impose a legal requirement on dog walkers to carry poop scoops and bags and things?
Yeah, well, they can. And that it can be a legal requirement to put in the order if that is what the authority felt was appropriate. So that's the answer to the question, really. The issue then is we know that 3 authorities have done that, and we're told verbally by colleagues there that enforcement is light touch. So it's a difficult one to enforce. We have to consider as an authority whether we want our enforcement officers, from whoever employs them, well, you know what I'm saying, do we want our enforcement officers going up to people and interrogating them for a poop scoop bag is one thing. Now, or we could choose to put them in and just say, look, we want to take it, because it's a statement of zero tolerance, and choose to take a light touch approach really on it, which is have an enforcement officer that will go and discuss it with the officer, with the members of the public, maybe hand them out, although there's resource implications of that, and just encourage, and that gives them an opportunity to talk about the orders and to say, look, you're supposed to carry a bag, and by the way, that's an exclusion. Did you see the signage coming in? That's an exclusion area, etc. And just have a general conversation and be slightly more educational. So it is, we've mentioned it here because a handful of people brought it up. Few authorities have done it and are taking more a light touch approach. No enforcement yet. And that's the approach they've taken. We could choose to put it in and take that approach, or we could just say, actually, we can review it in 3 years and perhaps we could consider it again then. I'd be interested in your views on that, on your recommendations, members. Thank you.
Councillor Shepherd, you indicated?
With the exception of obviously the schools and the sports pitches, would it be a viable option to go sort of like the built-up estates, because we've got a massive problem with dog fouling? Can't we go down the route of every dog must be on a lead in these estates? And I think it would benefit the stray dog problem. And if they do get taken to the dog pound and then they come home with a fine, because obviously your dog is out. That's the biggest problem we've got, is stray dogs, that they're dog fouling and there's no one to pick up after them. And I think it would support better ownership of the dogs.
Okay, this is where we as officers need to pigeonhole all the offences and talk them through one by one, so I appreciate that. So, stray dogs, if dogs are straying and they're on the public area, we've got a statutory duty to have a service for that, and that's already in place. So we can deal with stray dogs. The other part of the legislation you talked about there was dog fouling. Well, the dog fouling order will apply to all of these places. The issue of dogs on leads is an interesting one, because they aren't stray dogs. Stray dogs are where the owner isn't there, and it isn't in place at the moment in all public footpaths and that sort of areas. It's a different piece of legislation. Historically, we would have needed to consult the police on that, and we haven't done that on this occasion. Are you saying that you see people walking around that estate with a dog beside them that's not on a lead? Because I don't see that very often now. I don't know if other members do. It's strays. So, yeah, they are. It's strays. We've got legislation, and on complaint we'll go and patrol those areas. Fouling's covered. But really is the question is, do we want dogs on leads in those areas? Is it the significant problem that is it really a significant problem in the area? Is it people with status dogs and things like that, or what? We haven't consulted on that. Can the order apply? I think it probably can. We'd have to revisit that. But again, usually the legislation there is under highways legislation or road traffic legislation. And that hasn't been raised as an issue through the consultation either. Do you want to add anything, Richard?
Yeah, there were a handful of people, it is actually listed in the report, there were a handful of people that did suggest dogs to be kept on leads in all public places and footpaths, I think was mentioned in the report. We generally feel that to impose the requirement for dogs to be kept on a lead, that it's got to be proportionate, it's got to be based on evidence, it's got to be based on historical problems. We don't feel at the moment that we have enough evidence to open up that offence to all public areas in the borough. Obviously, we've got an outstanding issue over our ability to enforce the areas that we're proposing, let alone any others. Some local authorities have extended their dogs on lead restrictions to all public areas, but no doubt that'll be based on evidence. The legislation also gives us the option to consider the requirement for dogs to be put on a lead by direction from an authorised officer. Some local authorities in Wales have adopted that particular power, and it does come under the suite of powers that are available to us. So there it's an offence for a dog owner not to put the animal on a lead when instructed to do so, and the requirement for that is that it is out of control, or it's dangerous, or it's causing annoyance to people in the neighbourhood, or is intimidating or whatever. So again, maybe it's a matter for further debate.
I think dogs on leads by direction requires somebody there to direct them to do it.
Yeah.
And we've already talked about only having one enforcement officer in the area, and would they be there to direct them to do it? So it's about the enforcement presence there. And there's other legislation for dangerous dogs as well. Dogs that are the dangerous breeds or acting dangerously is a responsibility for the police as well. So it all depends on the actual issues that you've got in your area. If you want to have a chat afterwards, or another time, we're happy to do it.
Yeah, thank you. Councillor Tu, you've indicated.
How much will the fines be going forward, and is it likely that the fees will increase?
Currently, the fine is £100. That is the standard fine for the public space, the maximum fine for the public space protection order legislation. And in a way, that's why the fine was changed a couple of years ago now, to bring it up to that, so it wasn't going to change at this point in time. So there's no proposals to change that at this time. There's no proposals to increase it, because we can't, and there's no proposals to change it at this time. Members may wish to consider a change.
Councillor Shepherd, you've indicated.
With third parties who lease land from the council, how are they going to comply with the dog orders if, say they want to do, like you mentioned earlier, dog walking classes, or if we wanted to put a dog-friendly cafe, how ours is a community centre, it's not just a playing area. So how do we go around this? And if we wanted to have a dog show, which they used to have sort of once a year, as a summer event, is there an exemption? Could you apply for exemption once a week, twice a week? Are these things going to be in place?
Certainly, an annual event like a dog and horse and dog show or something like that, and it's on a parcel that's ordinarily excluded, then I've had a situation like that in other areas where we've done an exemption for the day under certain conditions about dogs being kept on a leads and hoop scoops in the area being kept clean and things like that. We'd have to look at, I think, the exact detail of your situation that's specific there, because it may be that it's not necessary to exempt if it's just on a certain parcel of land. Again, the parcels are quite tight, specific, so they are playing surfaces, school playgrounds, children's play areas, and the areas around them should be fine for dogs that are under control.
If I can just
Sorry, Richard.
If I could just direct members to Appendix 2 of the report, which is the draft order. I'll just give you a second to find that. When you get to Appendix 2, I believe it's page 3. So it's Part 2, dog exclusion. So what? Okay, sorry, thanks, Chair. Yeah, I've got different numbers here. So we're looking at Part 2, dog exclusion. So what's set out here is a draft order. that may need further slight amendment, but generally speaking, this is how we see the order being written up. And if we look at Part 2, dog exclusion, and you go to 4B, there already are exemptions available there for the landowner. And you know, an event such as this could come under that exemption. It would be a matter for the landowner.
But so the event, the example I'm referring to, it was local authority land. We exempted it for the day for the horse and dog show. But if it's something that's less than annual, or more often than annual, then I'm wondering whether it would be necessary. We need to consider the exact situation there.
Moving forward from that, if there was consultation not received or missed, and there are plans for the weekly use of a community hall or an area, then perhaps moving forward the exemption or the exclusion of that should be removed. Is a recommendation really that we should be putting forward there. If I think. I know that there's another question relating to use of private land, but I think that I'm on the back of that, really. Land that's leased, council land that's leased to organisations, if they don't want an exclusion or a lead-only order on the land, the public land that they lease, where would that stand? Could it be forced? Is on the back of that question, really.
Chair, our stance at the moment is for all of the CAP pitches, so these are the transferred pitches where the local authority remains the landowner but has no responsibility for maintenance and upkeep. So for the CAP pitches, our stance is that we've mapped them. We are proposing to include them in the exclusion order, providing they're marked pitches, of course, on the basis that if at any point over the next 3 years when the order is in force, the individuals responsible for those pitches come to us and put the signage up and say that they want enforcement on their pitches, then it's in the order and we're able to do that quite quickly. We have had, as you can see from the report, a number of committee members and so on that have not responded to our attempts to contact them in the consultation. So it's fair to say we don't really know what their position is. What I can say, I haven't had anybody who's responsible for a marked sports pitch come back to me saying we don't want any exclusion on our pitches. They pretty much all said unanimously that we have a problem with dog fouling on our pitches, and before we can allow our members to play, we've got to go and walk up and down the pitch and remove faeces. So it is definitely a problem in Torvine, with the only exception being the bowling greens, who are quite happy they don't want the restrictions there. So as I say, our stance is to leave them in. There will be no enforcement of the dog exclusion offence where there is no signage in place.
Chair, we were in a tricky position on this, and we had to make a decision one way or the other whether to include them so that there's potential for enforcement in the future, or exclude them now, and then it's a lot of work to review them and do it every 3 years. We'd rather just do this once every 3 years if we have to. So we'd be interested in the views of the committee on that approach. Thank you.
Councillor Thomas, I think you've indicated.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, a concern I have, wasting money enforcing on private land. Is there an opportunity for private land owners to contribute to the scheme, like RSLs, National Resource Wales, etc.?
This is a debate that we've had before, isn't it, when we've talked about the current enforcement initiative. And as a response to recommendations from the scrutiny, we have made contact with various organisations, including the RSLs, and they've not either not responded, or I think one of them did, and they decided that they didn't want to. It was the main housing association in the area. Again, it's. I think. Yeah. Sorry. No. I think there's It depends on your definition of private land, I suppose, in a way, because we've talked about the cap pitches. Are those classed as private land? Should we be enforcing on there? I would say that we should, where they're in agreement and they've put the signage up there. We've had this debate about litter. I won't necessarily get into that now. We've got the private pitches as well. I don't want to get into enforcement too much now, as you probably know. Yeah, right. With the litter, and you know, it's for me, and my advice will always be, and for you to consider, is it's a policy decision for the authority. It's not necessarily. We've got a clean and green priority. And dog fouling is what we're talking about here in the main, which is a public health issue. And whether it be on public or private land, I wouldn't want us not to take it, you know, to enforce on private land, and then the following day a child picks up a dog feces, rubs it in their eye, and gets blinded by it. If I'm honest with you, and that's us as public health people, yeah. So you know, and that can be on a sports pitch that's a cat pitch. It can be on public land. And as far as I'm concerned, and we've had this debate in the past, it can be on McDonald's car park. This is dog fouling, this is a public health issue. It's not just dirty, smelly feces, it can potentially affect somebody's life quite considerably. And if we're taking a zero tolerance approach to everywhere in the borough, that is my advice always to members.
I am going to comment here because we're also, public health is a huge consideration, but we're in massive budget cuts. We are the keepers of the pot of money, and I personally, I think that the use of public money for enforcing on privately owned land or land owned by RSLs, etc., who have made no input, made no effort to be involved with this consultation, I think, quite frankly, is really dire. For me, public money should be spent enforcing publicly owned areas. It sits very uncomfortable for me when RSLs or private land owners not only don't want to engage in this process, but have actively said no to any input or any financing in other things. And I think that we have an obligation to spend our money, our public money, publicly enforcing on publicly owned land. And I think that going back to our previous meetings, we are very limited on the number of enforcement officers that we have, one, and going back to the stats of previous meetings, that enforcement officer spent an extraordinarily large amount of time on privately owned land, aka Cwmbran Shopping or Cwmbran Centre, and I don't want to see public money supporting private businesses and private developments without them part funding it. That's my stance and my stance alone, but I couldn't let the opportunity go and miss saying it.
Yeah, I just like to back you up on that, because I think that's an important statement that you've made, and I think perhaps that should be fed back to him, really.
Those views have been expressed before. We know the committee feels strongly on those. We went back to Cwmbran Shopping Centre. We're talking about the litter side now, of course. We went back to Cwmbran Shopping Centre and we offered them an opportunity to fund some work, and they didn't respond. They didn't respond, or I don't think you were involved, Richard, so it was Andrew. Or at least what I'll say is it didn't go anywhere. I think there was some dialogue and it didn't go anywhere. And as far as I'm aware, there's no or very little enforcement going on anyway at this time, but you'll probably tell me otherwise now. But we've taken on board the comments of the committee, and there's certainly focus targeting on the hotspot areas.
See, many of the open spaces and some of the pitches were transferred over to RSLs and are still owned by RSLs. Not only are they not engaging in this process, but of course the likelihood is none will want to contribute to the enforcement. And is it right and proper that the local authority foot the bill for enforcement on privately owned and registered social landlords? That's the debate that we'll have afterwards and formulate a recommendation around. But I think you're getting a strong sense of feeling there. We shall go on to the next question. I think that's Councillor Evans.
How will income be utilised generated from issuing FPNs?
The current model, further to scrutiny and taking on scrutiny's recommendations, and as the executive member who came on the 7th of March confirmed, income from the fines has been retained by the local authority, and it is being used to offset the cost of the current enforcement strategy, and that will continue going forward. If we ever got to a situation where there was so much enforcement we were in a surplus, then obviously that would be reinvested in the service, either by way of buying bins or maybe giving pre-poop scoop bags. We wouldn't necessarily be looking to profit as a local authority from any kind of enforcement initiative. It would need to be reinvested back, and we're obliged to do so. So as it stands at the moment, it's being utilised, it's coming back into the local authority, and it's being utilised to offset the cost of enforcement, and as it stands, there's no plans to change that.
Councillor Shepherd's got a little bit of a supplementary to that.
Surely it's proportional, obviously, from a business side. More enforcement officers, more fines. You know, so one in this area, one in this area, one in this area. One person can't cover the whole borough. It's impossible, but these dogs are still dog fouling everywhere. So, more...
Well, we're converted to the argument that the more enforcement, the better. It really is a question of resources. So, you know, as officers, we would advise as much enforcement as the authority can afford, and we will continue to do that. It is more enforcement, more offences, but if the zero tolerance, again, and I know members have heard me say this in the past, and it is the case, is that if it's excluded just to the dog control offences, especially dog fouling, it's very difficult to catch. It's very difficult to catch because you have to be in the right place at the right time when the person is allowing their dog to foul and not properly cleaning up after them. And so really you do need a lot more people if you're really going to hit that hard and be able to demonstrate a lot of fixed penalty notices served for that. So it is more difficult, and it's unlikely that if we were to enforce just for dog fouling and the other dog control of offences, that it would ever be a neutral cost to the local authority. It would always be a cost, and therefore we would need investment.
To Mills, I think you've indicated.
Thank you, Chair. You partially answered this, but have you done an extensive research into what other local authorities are doing, not only in Wales but in England? And have you come up with examples of best practice and incorporated that into this order?
Is that in relation to the order or enforcement? Okay. Well, Richard's done some recent. He's done it looks like most local authorities in Wales have got dog control orders of a kind, or public space protection orders, and very similar to our own. Dogs excluded from, I'm looking at one authority, a neighbouring authority has got a requirement to carry appropriate receptacle, and they've got a 4-month trial on that at the moment. Dogs on leads by direction, as we touched on earlier. And dogs on leads on children's play areas, and some authorities have got it in memorial grounds and cemeteries, which is something we touched on when speaking to the report, and members may wish to consider that. Some authorities that are coastal have got them on dog exclusion areas on beaches and are seasonal, and one authority which has got a lot of coastline does have dog fouling order on there, but they're no longer enforcing restrictions on beaches due to budget cuts. So it's obviously not paying for itself, because otherwise it's not washing its face financially. So it's a mixed bag, And as far as public and private enforcement, I know we don't want to get onto that necessarily too much, but you'll usually find the areas that have got private enforcement will be serving a lot more fixed penalty notices and having a system that will be self-financing. And there's a mixed bag of that in Wales as well. There's a North Wales authority that serves over 3,000 fixed penalty notices a year, and yeah, that's a private enforcement initiative there. Usually the authorities, if we looked at the stats, which I know we did, it wasn't this SAFER, it was the previous, last year's SAFER, I looked at it with members of that, and we looked at some stats there, and we see, you can tell the authorities that have got private enforcement and the authorities that have got in-house enforcement. And, you know, that's a debate we've had. I think if I know members here wanted in-house enforcement, and we're working towards that over the next few months, but I think the expectation should be not that there'll be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fixed penalty notices served. It would be, especially if we're focusing on dog exclusion, and expectations here are important. Hope that answers your question, Robert.
Sorry, if I can have another go, please. In paragraph 11.5, you state further significant resources will be needed to enable implementation of the order subject to approval. So can you give us some idea of what the significant resource will be? So if you're going to spend, and again, your words, not mine, significant resource on this, what are we not going to spend it on? And did you make it clear in the public consultation that how much this was going to cost, so therefore the taxpayer knows that their taxes are going to be spent on this and necessarily not on something else would they hold as a higher priority?
It wasn't raised in the consultation. We didn't discuss the costs with the public of implementation.
Sorry, do you not feel that the public should be made aware of the costs and therefore the knock-on implications? So therefore, as I say, if we're spending money on this, what are we not spending it on?
It is a good point. In 11.3, I've indicated some costs in the 2 bullet points there. As to what the likely costs are for the departmental budgets. It could be, until we review this, as I said before, it's going to be staff time, it's going to be costs which will be met from existing budgets, and it's going to be costs in relation to advertising and a review of signage, and they've been estimated there. And we've put estimated costs in there. It's up to members whether they feel that that's adequate. It's up to members. You know, we're happy to take your views on whether you think those costs are significant. It's not hundreds of thousands of pounds. It's officer time, which is already in the revenue budgets, and we'll prioritise that during the year. And it's obviously going to be a little bit of capital outlay for the relevant departments who are responsible. So if signage needs to be changed, it's going to be schools. It's going to be grounds maintenance. It's going to be those who are responsible. It's going to be the landowners. And we've talked on about the private premises and the cap premises, if you like, and that some have already purchased signs off us. Richard will be able to give you information on that. But again, it's for the responsible landowners to put the signage up. We'll fund things like stickers on lampposts for dog fouling and things like that. We've got those. And they don't cost a lot. It's not significant. I think in terms of the council's budget, I put £6,000 here, but in terms of the council's budget, it's pennies really. Although every penny counts, I acknowledge that these days. No, we haven't consulted, but I hope I've answered the rest of your question.
So Jones, I think you indicated next.
In 10.37, you state there's a confusion between dog exclusion zones and dogs on leads. How will you make this clearer going forward?
Thanks very much. So the comment in 10.37 really was just to give mention to the fact that when I analysed the results and the comments that respondents came back with, there was some confusion making a distinction basically between the questions about dog exclusion, which were sort of one part of the consultation, and then the questions about dogs on leads. Despite our best efforts to silo those questions so that the responses were separate, lots and lots of people took the opportunity, for example, to comment about our thoughts on dogs on leads restrictions in the dog exclusion question, if you see what I mean. And I think it was because some people feel so strongly about dogs being required to be put on leads that they just used it as an opportunity to comment and voice their objection in particular in the question that was really aimed at, please give us your thoughts on dog exclusion. So that was the only point I'm trying to make with 10.37. But just to pick up the second part of your question, how are we going to address that confusion moving forward? As we said earlier, it's going to be down to publicity. It's going to be down to adequate number of temporary site notices to bring people's attention to the imminent implementation, and then it will also be down to the permanent signage that, as I said earlier, will need to go up at every designated area where we wish to enforce these restrictions.
Thank you. Mr. Shepherd has indicated.
It's two parts really, just to move us on a little bit quicker. I'm still struggling with the enforcement issue. At £100 a fine every single time, have we seen the amount of rubbish and dog poo there is around the borough? Surely, it's going to be viable that we can have quite a few enforcement officers. It's everywhere. So that bit I don't really understand. But how are we going to prioritise the patrols of this one person that we have?
Yeah, there's lots of litter, and we see dog fouling on the ground, but that it outrages us, it outrages me, and then I know it outrages everybody who's of right mind. But the issue is catching them doing it, and that's the issue, and that is quite a tricky thing. People walk their dogs in the mornings, they walk their dogs in the evenings after dark, so it's quite easy to get away with it. And I think, and I remember putting this in the scrutiny report, quite specifically. I think people know it's wrong and they'll wait till nobody's looking and things like that. So, and so it is a good point, because we are very much with these orders and very much with any publicity campaigns, etc., preaching to those who already know. It's those who don't who don't care that we're looking to catch. So that goes on to the second part of the question, which is something that's been raised by members before and right at the start of the meeting, which was around how do we know where this person is. And he's directed on a regular basis, and we provided evidence in the report in October now. There was a list at the back there of all the areas that the enforcement officer at the time, I don't know, councillor basically requested, which we can do, is regular updates to all members on where the enforcement officer has been and the number of fixed penalty notices served. How do we target it? It's based on local intelligence, it's based on hotspot areas, and that's come from the community, come from complaints from officers, from ongoing intelligence from local ward members and others. And we'll continue to do that.
Thank you. For me, how can we ensure that we're not pushing the problem into other areas? What can we do about that? How can we ensure that that doesn't happen?
Again, it's a valid point. As we discussed earlier, as we see it, we've got three main priority areas for exclusion anyway. The school grounds, the children's play areas and marked sports pitches. There is always a risk that when we start to enforce this, as we saw last summer, you do indeed push some of those shall we say, persistent offenders, those who are just not prepared to learn a lesson and want to continue to allow their dogs to foul when they think nobody's looking. It's unfortunately, it's always the irresponsible minority that we've got to try and address. And those irresponsible few will go elsewhere to allow the dog to foul. The only good news we can offer is that, as Dave said, we rely heavily on complaints. We monitor the complaints constantly. We're looking for patterns. We're looking for any trends. We're looking in shifts in trends. We're relying on intelligence, from members of the community and members and anybody else basically that rings in to complain about dog fouling. It will happen, especially in the areas where we have a bit of a blitz on enforcement. But please bear in mind that the offence of dog fouling will remain in those areas where people will be displaced to. So we will have provision to deal with it, assuming we've got the resources. Then it's all about us constantly evolving, isn't it, and moving those resources around to where it's most needed. It's going to be an ongoing battle, I'm afraid.
Councillor Mills, you've indicated you've got some question around that.
As a sort of supplementary to that, you say you rely heavily on complaints, but I know a number of residents that over the years said to me, I used to complain, but I don't waste time complaining now because nothing happens. So therefore, I think somewhere in the report it says the number of complaints are coming down. They're coming down because people just can't be bothered to complain anymore because nothing happens.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a fair point, if I'm honest. There is perhaps a frustration out there, and that goes back to what we talked about earlier, which I know you agree with, which is around having a strong enough enforcement presence to be able to demonstrate, and one person perhaps isn't enough. And so we've had that debate, haven't we? So that is part of it. And as Richard said, it's about if it pushes it out into other areas, we'll see the evidence on the ground, we'll get complaints. We'll see the evidence on the ground of the dog fouling, and we'll have to target the enforcement officer there.
Councillor, your comment really was echoed by 95 respondents on page 8. I've got it down as 10.2.1. So when it comes to the question about dog fouling, 95 respondents questioned the council's ability to enforce the legislation and would like to see more enforcement. Now, when you drill down into the I've condensed those comments into just one line there, but what an awful lot of people were saying is, yes, we fully support this, but we question your ability to enforce it adequately. So that is something we're aware of. I would like to think, however, that since we've engaged with the services of Kingdom, that we regularly send them patrol requests as and when complaints come in about dog fouling, and on average we're getting, I would say, a couple of complaints a week on average. People ringing in complaining about dog fouling on a street or a play park in their area, and I can 100% assure you that every single one of those is now written up, a map is generated, given as much detail as possible, even down to street level. That is then referred to our enforcement officer, and they add it to their patrol list. So maybe some of that suggestion, disappointment that's been expressed, I would like to think was maybe pre-2017, because it is fair to say that there wasn't an awful lot of enforcement going on between 2014, I think it was, and 17.
Then maybe there would be an exercise there. Going back to Ray's request earlier on in the meeting for lists of where the patrols are taking place and the number of fines, perhaps there should be for several months an exercise where officers are sending out information to Kingdom that they could look at that information combined with it, so that you could see yourselves if the reports are actually being identified and picked up in the areas and the tickets. It would be a good way to see if you are not being ignored, for want of a better description.
I also think some of the frustration is born out of the fact that, as we mentioned earlier, it's very difficult to catch a dog fouling offence in the act. Very often because they're out very early, or they're out very late at night, or the weekends. Now, there is provision for some patrols outside of those normal hours, but it is limited, especially when you've got one officer. So, I think some of the frustration is the fact that someone rings in, they complain about dog fouling on their street, and it's still going on, a fortnight later, because that officer has got to be present at that time to witness it.
I think the next question is Councillor Hawley. Yeah, you've indicated.
Thank you very much, Chair. You've touched on earlier about having an appropriate amount of resources in place with the funding available. But do we have the resources in place to enforce the order and deal with appeals and prosecutions? And do you think further training is required to bring officers up to speed with PSPO enforcement requirements?
Well, the first part was about the resources for enforcement, and I think we've touched on that really. We've just got the one officer at the moment. We do have other officers in the public health team who will, from time to time, if they catch somebody, serve fixed penalty notices. But their role is very multidisciplinary, and they're very much the people, if I was to name them, you know who was talking about, who respond to the general public health complaints and housing queries about standards and things like that. And they're very involved. They get involved with this work in relation to helping out identifying where posts are required for signage and etc. So we don't have the resources for them to go out and just do 100% enforcement all the time. Another part of what they do from time to time is a little bit of proactive stuff, especially on school runs and things like that. They'll go and spray dog excrement and help out for a couple of hours. But as I said, they do have the powers. So really, it really is a question of investment in an enforcement capacity. And depending on what we want that enforcement capacity to be, then we need to make a decision on the approach we're going to take, whether it's going to be litter hotspots as well, and because that is an offence that's where people are, and that's an offence which is easily witnessed, or whether we want something else which is not going to generate the income to be able to fund patrols for dog fouling. So that is the resources element. As far as training is concerned, there'll be whoever does the work will be undertaking relevant training for issuing the fixed penalty notices. That's already in place. The actual physical training hasn't changed from it being a dog control order to it being a public space. For it being a public space protection order, there's no necessarily. It is the same process that they go through and the same offences that they're witnessing. As far as appeals and things like that, well, anybody who's issued with a fixed penalty notice for any of the offences doesn't have to pay it. They can indicate on there that they choose to go to court. A bit like a driving offence, you can either pay a fixed penalty or go on every day in court. So it's a little bit like that. So that is always an option. But the authority, we will always consider any representations that are made by an individual, any extenuating circumstances in relation to disability, mental capacity, things like that, or made by somebody on their behalf as well, really. And we will treat each case on an individual sort of basis, and from time to time, a lot of tickets are rescinded as a result. So that's already that usually goes to the team manager. And that's something that he is well practiced at, and others are as well. And sometimes it's escalated up to other officers as well, and even the chief officer and the executive member as well. So, on the odd occasion, so there is a process in place, but ultimately people can either choose to pay or choose not to pay, and going at the end of the day, it's a criminal. It's an offence which is triable in court. Okay.
Thank you. I think Councillor Horler.
Do we have a date when the order will go to Cabinet for ratification, please?
Not an exact date at the moment. We touched on this earlier. We're aiming for June. If we can get there earlier, we can. But obviously, as I said earlier, we've to take your recommendations on board and consider them with the executive member before, and to take care of instructions and make the recommendations to Cabinet and put it into the system then. So ideally as soon as possible, but I'm thinking that it could be June with an implementation date, as I indicated earlier, a couple of months after, perhaps the end of the summer.
Councillor Tu.
Will the contact details be on the signs so that members of the public can help us identify irresponsible dog owners?
It's a good question, that. Are they on, I don't think they're on the signs at the moment. We'll consider that. I don't think they're on the signs at the moment, but we'll consider that. You have to get so much in on the sign. It needs to be bilingual and etc. And there could be signs with maps and that sort of thing, but it's something we'll consider.
You know, the gentlemen who go and empty the bins, they actually go to these areas every day. Why can't they be given the powers to catch people with their dogs off the leads in these areas?
Yeah, it's a valid point. It's something the street scene officers, we've had dealt with them and given them some training for other types of enforcement around fly tipping and stuff like that in the past. It's not always worked well. It's certainly been a training issue for them. It's certainly been a challenge for them, and it's not always worked as well as the professionally trained officers would have liked, really. But again, with that could be possible if he or she could be a witness and fill in a witness statement if they know the person. It's identifying them. Perhaps they could take photographs and stuff like that. But again, it's with dog fouling especially. It's about time and place. You know, it's about being there at the time, and so it would still have that same sort of challenge. But I take your point, and I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah,
Richard?
it is an interesting point. But in reality, it really isn't that simple. You know, a lot of these staff members and employees, it's certainly way beyond their job description. In some cases, it's way beyond their level of comfort. Some cases, way beyond their level of ability. It's not something that many of them have to say, because we have tried going down this route in the past many times. It's really not something many of them are prepared to put their hand.
Members of the public think they're the people who are watching up for them.
Yeah, agreed, especially if they're wearing some form of council uniform. But it is a very, enforcement requires a particular skill set, is extremely confrontational. At the end of the day, these are £100 fines, and some people don't react too well to that, as you well know. So it's something we will always consider, but in reality, it is very difficult.
It's probably the most challenging one to do, because you've got to approach somebody and indicate who you are, and they do it in a very professional, trained way. And usually when they approach them, they turn on their body cameras, and you can often review that footage, because we often get complaints about their attitude, etc. But it's not like issuing a parking ticket or anything like that, which is usually done on the vehicle when the person isn't there. It's really about having that dialogue with the person, and it's a sort of area where you got a high level of staff turnover, and people try it and then they go, and this is where because they get a better job basically in their eyes, or they can only take so much. And this is the thing about in-house versus private. I know you don't want to go down that road, but this is the thing around in-house and private, because if we have one person in-house, for example, when they're on leave, there's nobody to do it. When they're off sick, because of perhaps confrontation or stress, there's nobody to do it, and we've no enforcement presence. So when we go outside for it, we're basically passing those management headaches onto another organisation, and they're contracted to provide somebody in the area, and we get a more sustainable enforcement presence that way. So it's a very challenging area. Now, who knows? There may be other types of enforcement that are coming up over the next year or two. And I know we're in discussions with the chief officer around duelling up around those, around parking and things like that. Perhaps the potential for a broader presence then. But there's some work to do on that yet, etc.
Mr. Hawley, you've indicated.
Thank you, Chair. I take it that if we had our own staff doing the job as well, the ones that are normally emptying the bins, there'd be many duty of care implications with that and putting them in a situation. I mean, there's too many ramifications with that, I would have thought.
Yeah, again, there is duty of care to them, there's confrontation, etc. And, loan working, things like that. So these are things that the private organisation sets up themselves, basically. So, and you know, for staff who are used to being just going around driving in the van and to then start approaching people, and you know, usually let's just say it may not come naturally to them, and it may put them off doing the work, and you may get rises in sickness and things like that. But again, the other, when you employ somebody directly to do it all the time, you'd be looking for somebody who is got all the appropriate background, some of the appropriate background, the appropriate personal skills, and the appropriate level of academic achievement to be able to, you know, be able to talk to people and analyse the law and be able to explain things in a certain way, which is one of the challenges that you get where you've got basically sort of other operatives who have mainly got another job doing the work, who are not necessarily trained in enforcement.
The other concern, of course, when we've put this question to relevant members of staff and employees, you know, the concern is that if they issue a ticket to someone and it's a very aggressive or violent encounter, they've got to go back to that same place the next day, because, for example, if part of their work is Pontypool Park and that's where they're supposed to go every day, then they've got to go back to that location having gone through that. Lots of employees actually live in the borough as well. So there's the potential that they could bump into the very same person they've issued a ticket with whilst they do their shopping on a Saturday, and you don't really have any of those issues with private staff that you bring in from an outside organisation. And it's for those reasons why, when we put this proposal to staff and employees in the past, like you say, grounds maintenance, there's no take up for it.
And of course, grounds maintenance wouldn't be cammed up, because the officers who are dealing with it on a day-to-day basis, as they go to issue a fine or whatever, I believe they turn the camera on every time.
Yep, they record the interaction between themselves and the person, and that's kept for a significant amount of time, sometimes up to 7 years if there's been a prosecution as a result of it. So, and it can be used as evidence in court because, as you know, very often accusations by people who are outraged by getting a ticket. Many people think £100 is quite a lot for what they see as quite a low-level offence. They're outraged by it and they make all sorts of accusations. They may come to yourselves as members, they may come to us as officers directly, and they will make accusations about the officer. And it does happen, and once we review the video footage, we see that actually, no, it's been exaggerated, and the officer's been very professional, and they've had to probably had to deal with quite a bit of abuse from the person as well, really. So it's a very challenging job, and not one that I wouldn't like. I've done bits of enforcement, as Richard has, basically, but I wouldn't like to go and do that every day. I must admit, it's worse than being a traffic warden, I think. Not that that's bad.
So who will be responsible for challenging performance and reviewing success of the order?
Well, it's a good question. Obviously, there'll be regular reports to the chief officer within the department, to the executive member, perhaps further scrutiny, and we can look at data. It all depends how we measure success, really. It depends really what we want. Do we see success as a large number of fixed penalty notices being served, or do we see success as being high levels of patrols in the area and a reduction in cost of cleaning up dog fouling, and reduction in complaints, and anecdotally it being cleaner, because very often where people say, oh, it seems cleaner now, we've got this enforcement, although that's hard to measure. So it's the definition of success. If we measure success on the number of fixed penalty notices served, that's easy, it's hard data, as long as we understand that some of the offences are difficult to especially dog fouling, we will not be getting high numbers, we won't get hundreds of thousands of those. And it all depends on what we want them to do. If we want enforcement of clean and green, for example, we can produce lots of data. There's an authority in North Wales that serves 3,000 fixed penalty notices a year. They will be for litter, most of them will be for cigarette butts. And that's the, but if, it's about where we want to stand, not as an authority, actually, what is our stance on this? do we have a zero tolerance approach, or do we want to say, well, we just want lots of patrols in the area, and we want to educate people, and we want to take the approach of issuing warnings on some occasions or fixed penalty notices just where we catch for dog fouling or on exclusion areas. In that case, that's fine. It will need investment and it won't come free of charge. So the usual approaches will be for measuring enforcement and measuring success, but we need to define what that is. Because if it's number of tickets, then we may not see it as successful for all the investment, because the numbers that we want may not be as high as we perceive.
I suspect then maybe it would be a combination of, level of tickets, but backed up with data that cost of cleaning up areas is reducing. I think it would need to be a number of factors fed into that. I don't think any one standalone would be the answer. I think Councillor Evans, you've indicated.
What will the current and future challenges be associated with with implementing the order, and how would you overcome these?
Well, the current challenges are it's been a challenging process practically. A lot of officer time on the consultation, and obviously we'll take members' recommendations on board. So we've got some milestones there, and I've touched in answer to a previous question and in the report around the likely costs, further officer time, and about £6,000 so of costs really there. And then going forward as budget cuts, it all depends how we're affected by the budget cuts really. Obviously we've got the enforcement, which we've touched on a lot, so I won't go back, and what a challenge that is around appropriate and how we measure success. That's a challenge to overcome. And then in 3 years or so, less actually, to say that this time in 3 years, one of us or both of us, or neither of us, will be sat here again having a dialogue with you around another consultation and another review of the orders, because they only last for 3 years now. So it's got to be done on a regular basis. So that will be a challenge as resources continue to bite. So I think we've touched on a lot of them already in the meeting, but this doesn't end. It's only the start of a cycle, really. And that's why we've tried to take a sensible approach to including cat pictures that haven't responded, so we can bring them in without having to do a full consultation again. Because this is a resource drain, and I'm not, I've been running budgets for about 10 or 15 years now, and I don't think we've had a budget increase in the last 10, I don't think, have we? So it's only going to go down, isn't it, really? So we need to make this sustainable.
Just my last question, really, I suppose, is private landowners were consulted. How did you pick which ones you consulted? Did you have any responses? Is there an example of?
Yes, Chair. So in the report, just listed obviously the statutory consultees. So 8.2 in the report, and then I think we got into point 23 in particular. I talk about the large registered social landlords. In the borough. So I direct emailed every single large registered social landlord that we have. Certainly each and every one of those listed there. So they got a direct email, but in addition to that, they would have had the Facebook posts, they would have seen the press releases and so on. And in addition to that, of course, conversations with individuals, because when you visit some of their websites, it can be a little confusing as to exactly who your inquiry needs to be directed to. So there were lots of phone calls, and so on. In terms of responses, I did get a response from half of them, I would say. But when I say a response, I mean an acknowledgement response, saying, thank you for your email, I have forwarded this on to, such and such, or this particular department. And for the rest of them, there was either no response or a very basic sort of, read receipt type response.
In relation to number 22, really, private landowners, who were they, or an outline of other than RSLs?
Yeah.
Sorry. The one that springs to mind straight away is Pontypool Park Estate, for example. They own quite substantial amounts of land in the borough, lots of sort of green open space. I did get a response. They did make a contribution, generally speaking in support of what we're trying to achieve. And then the rest of the private landowners would have been picked up at a much smaller scale, and private landlords and so on. A lot of those wouldn't have been direct emailed because there's far too many of them. So they would have picked up the consultation via all of the work that we did on social media and the press.
Thank you for that, members. Are there any other questions? No? Oh, sorry, Councillor Hawley. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. You said that we currently have the highest fine of £100 that's available to us as a fixed penalty. If someone doesn't pay that, I know that other councils, you can raise it to £1,000. Is that the same for our council as well?
The maximum fine in court is £1,000, unless it's changed recently. I don't think it answers it. Okay. So that's the fixed penalty notice fine. If they don't pay that, then we would prosecute them. A prosecution file would be put together, and that would be put through the court system. And that's the maximum fine available for this offence. So you're talking somebody who's a repeat offender again and again and again would probably get a maximum fine. So usually when they're prosecuted for the offence, they'd get a similar fine or a little bit more from the court, and the court retains that fine then. We, an authority on a successful prosecution, would be awarded costs, which are usually £50 to £100 as well, and then there's what they call a victim surcharge, which is a bit of a tax that the court puts on there as well, basically. So that's where the maximum. It's a maximum fine, and you'd have to be somebody who's not only dropping litter all the time, but getting caught all the time as well, basically, to the point where we wouldn't even issue a fixed penalty notice on them. We just prosecute them, basically. So, but you may see signs going forward in the future where you may see, very often for reasons of economy, when it comes to like the dog fouling signs, we'll put stickers on lampposts, so they're quite inexpensive to produce, and they come on a big thick roll. And you might see in the future that that'll have the maximum fine of £1,000 on there. And the reason for that is because that's the maximum fine, and they can get that in theory. In practice, it's unlikely. But also, fixed penalty notices, fines can change. Sometimes you put it on there. I saw some in another authority area where it still had the old one of £75 on there from a previous dog control order. But I think we need to balance. We've already got a £100 fine. It's a maximum. It doesn't. I know people are upset when they get it, but I think the public are used to it. So, and there's no we can't put it up. It is really where it is, and that's why we've not necessarily put a proposal to change that. Although we'll happily take the views of scrutiny on that matter.
Well, members, Councillor Jones, yeah.
Just going back a bit, we were talking about having an outside company coming in and doing this for us. If we made the terms and conditions right for the people within our authority, wouldn't it be better to keep, to have it in-house? Because obviously, once we take it out, then if things go wrong, obviously we're not liable in one way, but then we get all the bad publicity, when these companies are shown to be aggressive in their stance and they end up on television and things like that. And on a slightly different point, when you've got somebody who's a repeat offender, isn't that often because they have behavioural issues and social issues? And then wouldn't it be better to, as you do with people who've had a driving offence, perhaps do a programme round helping them with education and helping them with social issues? As a caring council, should we not be looking at that as well?
Take the first one first, which was in-house against outside, which we've touched on a bit earlier. So the pros and cons, there's the complaints about them and the bad publicity that the outside organisation has had in the past. Terms and conditions of employment of local authority are a little bit more. Let me put it this way: if our strategy wanted to be, or was serving our measure of success that we touched on earlier, and serving as many fixed penalty notices as we could, that's more achievable with the private sector terms and conditions. Okay. Now I don't know the terms and conditions of that organisation, but I'm guessing that they want that they need their staff to witness so many offences a day, probably 3 or 4 or something like that, to enable fixed penalty notices to be served. And that's the thing. It might sound slightly aggressive, but they're only witnesses the offence that we have a zero tolerance to. So if they do that, and if that's a private sector organisation and they're not doing that, then they'll send them down the road and get somebody else in. And that's a little bit more challenging in local government because I'm sure the trade unions would have something to say if we started issuing those sorts of targets, and it wouldn't be our intention to do that. So, and of course, we've got the other issues there around, well, okay, if they're off sick, if they're on annual leave, then who's going to cover? And we get a more sustainable service from the private sector because we are contracting them in to do the work. And holidays and leave is not our problem. They need to staff themselves accordingly. But it would become a management problem for ourselves. Okay, because we would not have staff in the area doing that. So it's got pros and cons, but this is where we need to decide as an authority exactly what the approach that we want. And members of this committee have already spoken about the preference for in-house, and that's certainly something that will be considered when as favourably as possible over the next few weeks when the current arrangements come to an end at the end of June. Now I've forgotten the second part of the question now.
People who are repeat offenders or are often the vulnerable people in society, and perhaps education would be a good way to go with these people rather than just taking this, because £100 fine to one person is okay, but to another person is the difference between eating and living and making them go into a spiral of depression and things like this. And even though I think we should have a strong policy, surely a lot of it should be about education and taking people under our wing and things like this where we can.
I'm not aware, you're not aware of any other local authorities who've gone, a bit like on the speeding offence, not that I've ever done one, bit like on the speeding offences where basically you pay a little, you basically pay the fine by going on the training. I'm not aware of any local authorities that have done that, but it'd need to be funded, and so perhaps it would need to be an alternative to the fine in the same way that road traffic stuff is. So I think that's something that we'll certainly consider. We'll do some research on that, see if other local authorities have done that, and give that some consideration, because again, it would need to pay for itself. It would need to be, if we take the drive-in speed awareness training as an example. Again, not that I've ever done it, but it's something that they fund through the fines, isn't it? Really, yeah. So again, it comes back to cost and investment. But certainly, we've got tool van training in the borough, and we know we've got staff who go into schools, etc., in the countries, in the street scenes, section. So perhaps that's something we'll have a look into. It's a good idea.
Well, thank you very much, members. Any other questions? No, thank you. I'd like to thank you both for attending. I hope we haven't been too challenging, although I hope we have been a little challenging. But thank you very much for putting up with our questioning and giving us the report. There's not a need for you to stay for the next bits. I'm mindful of the time, and that. But thank you very much for your time, and thank you for. Thank you. I suppose for us, I'd like to sort of read out some of the Facebook comments, because there's been extensive consultation and there's been an awful lot of communication. So if I can just sort of highlight some, and if members want to highlight any. Julia Hart still. I don't care where a dog owner walks their dog as long as they pick up what their dog leaves as a natural function. There is more and more around where I live, and this is from dog owners who walk their dogs on pavements that are used by children on their way to and from school. Claire Cooper. It is irresponsible owners that have caused this to become such an issue. If everyone cleaned up after their dogs, and dogs with behavioural issues were kept muzzled and on leads, there would not be a problem. These people have spoilt walking for so many responsible owners, and they're woofers now. It's such a shame, but I fully understand why it has to come to this. I live on a street with a school at the end of it, and a number of owners don't even pick up after their doggies when they foul on the pavement, quite often right outside my gate. It's atrocious, and to see kiddies as young as 3 having to keep avoiding it and not always being successful, well, it is downright disgusting. A resident has even been leaving poop bags out attached to their gate with a sign for people to please use them if their dog's foul, but still they don't bother. Makes me mad. Then there was a Kath Hollister, drives me potty, excuse the pun, when people don't pick up after their dog. And similarly, I've always maintained that banning dogs from multiple areas without providing an enclosed area where dog walkers can take their dog is self-defeating. When I've suggested this in the past, you then get the anti-dog lobby or the irresponsible dog owners screaming, where's the money coming from? It can come from the removal of bins in the increasing number of areas where dogs are no longer allowed or severely restricted. And if we all picked up after our dogs, we wouldn't need a roaming dog warden issuing fines. There's another, really, Lisa Short. It's a shame that this appears another attempt at harassing and intimidating well-meaning members of the public for their dogs stepping on concrete or elderly people accidentally dropping a receipt to make money. I'm assuming this is, Education is the key if the council actually want to improve responsible dog owners and reduce littering. Clearly this is not the key concern. I think, there is sort of a broad of comments there that is anybody interested in any more of the comments, because I think very much they're all similar. Okay. Anyway, so let's go on to what we are being asked to scrutinise. We have been asked, the Safer Communities Overview and Scrutiny Committee has been asked to consider the public outcomes and the draft public spaces order as outlined in Appendix 2 and make the recommendations as necessary for consideration by Cabinet. So basically here what we're looking for is some recommendations. I've noted down a few, no doubt Leanne has, but I think maybe the biggest question that we should be discussing first is whether we continue to support these orders and are they necessary?
Sorry if I can say, surely it's all down to enforcement. What is the point in spending money on this if it's purely a tick box exercise? Because if it can't be enforced, it's pointless wasting money on it.
I agree.
If pure, on the last one we did 3 years ago, there was a huge outcry from dog owners, but very soon they realised it doesn't matter because you got very little or no chance of getting a ticket, so we just totally disregard it. And if we're going to spend thousands of pounds on signage, signs aren't cheap, right. Thousands of pounds on signage which you can't enforce. So it's purely an academic exercise, and the public will soon see that and come back and criticise us for wasting money on this that we could have used elsewhere, filling in potholes or whatever.
As a committee, are we supporting this? Or is there, yes, we're supporting it in principle, but with thee, or are we not wholeheartedly supporting it? Okay.
Can I just say, I see what Councillor Mills is saying, and I agree with you in many ways, but if we don't support it at all, might not then the dog issue get even worse, and then we have something big in the press or something, and them saying, well, it's all fine, don't do anything?
I would agree with the second option. We support it in principle as long as there is adequate enforcement.
Yeah.
So maybe that we are supporting in principle, but that, and having listened to what's gone on in committee, that that there should be adequate in-house enforcement, because I think nearly all of us have, again, suggested that enforcement should be brought in-house so that we have more control over it. So that probably is the first of our...
And like you said previous, about where they're actually patrolling and where the areas are being, monitored for this particular incident.
I wrote down here private land, because I don't know if you support me here, but I would personally like a recommendation to go forward that we don't enforce on privately owned land, and that includes RSLs.
Unless the landowner is willing to pay.
Yeah.
The other thing that was that I picked up, Councillor Tew, about the phone numbers actually being put on the signs. I think that's an important recommendation that we put forward. Cemeteries, they wanted the committee's opinion on cemeteries. I personally don't like the idea of enforcing cemeteries, but I'll go with the...
Can I just say, my mum comes up to a cemetery in Cumberland, which she paid extra to have my dad buried in, and she brings her dog. That's her life at the moment, and she wouldn't be able not to...
As long as the dog is on a lead, then that's fine. But we don't want dogs exercising in cemeteries, but as long as the dogs are on the lead, because I agree with you, a lot of elderly people take the dogs because the dogs was part of the family and so forth.
And so the recommendation really... I think in relation...
Just signage, because it's got 150 per sign plus VAT, that's £20,000 just for signage for those exclusions.
So cemeteries, our recommendation is that we don't support inclusion of any of the cemeteries in exclusion or lead only. Actually, we don't want them listed, full stop, yeah. That we would like... Another recommendation is that we would like dog-only walking pitches to be a huge consideration.
Yes, sorry, Chair, yeah, I think that's massive, really, that we should really get them to look into having actual dog designated areas. Like I said earlier on, we're big on exclusion zones and restricted areas. We really should try and push a dog area, really.
I think you've outlined one area that hundreds and hundreds of people drive to anyway. And I think maybe there was a little bit of misconception that we all wanted these little patches in each ward. I don't think that's the... I think, one north, one south maybe, that's away from residential. You outlined a really good area, and perhaps everybody can support that. I think the other thing that they asked us to have an opinion on is the enforcement of carrying poo bags. I personally don't like the idea of enforcing this, but...
It's not the carrying the poo bags. What's the point of carrying the poo bags if you're not going to use it? Yeah. It's the using it is the important bit. Yeah. You can walk down the road with a packet full of poo bags in your pocket. If you're not going to use it, it's totally pointless.
And of course there are other people that use tissue and carrier bags, and it's not just... So it's depending on the size of the dog, I'm assuming, but I personally don't support that and the recommendation from is that we don't support the enforcement of carrying pool bags.
Sorry, Chair. What did we say about the RSLs? What's the recommendation? What we put there for that?
The recommendation was more about private landowners that would include RSLs, and that we remove them from the enforceable areas because they've not participated in the consultation process. They're likely not wanting to pay towards enforcement, and is it right and proper that public money be used for private owners? Are we all in, or the majority of us in agreement with that?
Yeah, I mean, I like I said earlier, I think I agree with you. I think it's disgusting that they haven't got involved in this at all. It's unbelievable.
I'm absolutely shocked that, but particularly RSLs and an Iron Bevan, because they both will have the illness and sickness that's having an impact on, and the RSLs that, like we have the complaints, the Council for Publicly Owned Land, they have thousands and thousands of complaints. So not getting involved in something that really could have an impact completely shocks me. But was there anything? I know that I think I've missed my very first one.
Only that I think it was you, Chair, that said it. Detailed information and maps to be sent out to all ward members prior to the implementation.
That's
of
the one I
order.
missed. Yeah, I didn't write it. Are we all happy with those recommendations, members?
I know I mentioned it at the time, but a lot of the councils, you've only got to do a quick web search. They make a huge play of the fact that magistrates can impose a £1,000 fine as a deterrent. I think we really need to flag that up. Because for two reasons. Number one, it acts as a deterrent, and number two, people should be made aware of it before they get...
So in relation to the signage comment from Chris Q about putting phone numbers on there, that we also have the maximum fine that could be imposed, as it would be a good use of a deterrent. Yeah. And Faye.
I'd just say, to go with that then, that we're upping the education we got on the dangers of dog fouling and what we do. We need lots of education out there. You know, because the people we want it to hit are the people it never hits, the ones who've got such social problems, they walking around in their own world.
To the officers of the year, in the National Newspaper now came out before the meeting, there's a lot of controversy at the moment with this Alabama rot. They're walking their dogs, they only get a little cut or a fight or with another dog, and it's killing these dogs internally.
Yes,
so
incurable.
Yeah, it's, you know, what's the public health against that, and for kids and anything on playgrounds, you know.
Well, thank you, members. I think we've formulated our recommendations. Leanna's got them all written down. Thank you very much for your time and input. It's been yet again a wonderful meeting, and thank you for your input. Can I just remind you that our next meeting has been brought forward from the 10th of May to the 25th of April, so our comments can be considered by Cabinet. This meeting will look at Torvine's car parking policy. I think that's going to be a really good, meaty topic again, and I'm really pleased that it's been brought forward. So can I just thank you all for attending and your input, and I close the meeting.